investment. When most people think about the national debt, they imagine a huge number on a screen somewhere. But the real story is about how much of that debt we're paying in interest. And that's becoming a serious problem. Every year, the U.S. government has to set aside hundreds of billions of dollars just to cover interest payments on the debt. And this isn't money going toward hospitals, schools, or roads. It's money that simply disappears into interest, a cost for borrowing that keeps growing. As interest rates rise, so does the cost. Even a seemingly small increase can add tens of billions of dollars to the annual budget. This means that crucial programs that Americans rely on can face cuts or stagnation because more money is siphoned off to pay lenders rather than invest in the country's future. The problem gets even trickier because the U.S. government depends on borrowing to keep the economy running. When interest rates are low, it feels manageable, but that dependence is like building a house of cards. A small rate hike can dramatically increase the interest burden, and when you're paying more just to service the debt, there's less flexibility to respond to emergencies, recessions, or unexpected crises. It's not just a math problem, it's a policy problem too. Leaders have to balance the need for public spending with the reality that a bigger slice of the pie is going toward lenders every year. What makes this even more concerning is the compounding effect of interest. Debt doesn't just sit there. It grows, and as it grows, the interest payments grow along with it. Imagine paying off a credit card where the minimum payment barely covers the interest. That's essentially what's happening at the national level. Every new dollar borrowed today adds to tomorrow's interest burden. Over time, and this can accelerate the debt cycle and make it incredibly difficult to slow down the growth of the national debt. Even modest increases in interest rates or borrowing can have outsized effects on future budgets. Finally, investment. If we let this trend continue unchecked, the U.S. could find itself in a position with limited policy options. Credit rating agencies might downgrade the country's rating, which raises borrowing costs even further. Financial markets could experience volatility, and the ripple effects would reach every American, from higher mortgage rates to more expensive loans for businesses. Paying attention to debt interest isn't just a headline. It's about ensuring the government maintains fiscal flexibility to keep the economy strong and the country moving forward. The sooner we recognize the problem, the sooner we can start making choices that prevent interest from dictating the future of America's finances. Every year, the U.S. government faces a mounting challenge that many people don't fully grasp: the sheer size of its interest payments on the national debt. While the total debt figure often dominates headlines, the amount spent simply to service that debt is quietly growing into one of the biggest strains on the federal budget. Think of it this way: the government borrows money to fund a wide range of programs and services that millions of Americans rely on, from healthcare and social security to education and infrastructure. But each time the government borrows, it agrees to pay interest to the lenders. These interest payments are not optional, and they are growing faster than many other parts of the budget. As interest costs rise, a larger slice of taxpayer dollars is directed away from programs that directly benefit people and toward the cost of past borrowing. This is especially critical because the federal budget isn't infinite. Unlike a personal checking account where overspending can be managed by adjusting lifestyle choices, the government operates within strict allocations. When more money is consumed by interest payments, less is available for investments that could improve quality of life or stimulate economic growth. Over the past decade, the increase in debt interest has been substantial, and projections show it will continue to rise sharply if current borrowing trends persist. One of the major contributors to this is the sheer size of the national debt. The more money the government owes, the more interest it must pay. Even if interest rates remain relatively low by historical standards, the enormous volume of debt means that annual payments are climbing into the hundreds of billions. These payments are effectively a mandatory expenditure, leaving limited flexibility for discretionary spending. This is different from other areas of the budget that can be adjusted or reallocated. Interest payments are non-negotiable. Another factor amplifying the problem is that interest rates are not static. If market conditions shift and rates increase, the cost of servicing the debt can spike dramatically, compounding the pressure on federal finances. This makes long-term planning challenging because future budgets can be significantly affected by small changes in borrowing costs. Beyond just numbers on a page, the growing interest burden has real implications for Americans' lives. Programs like healthcare support, infrastructure maintenance, and public education may face constraints, delays, or cuts if more funds must be diverted to cover interest. That the ripple effect can touch everything from the quality of roads and bridges to funding for innovation and research. Ultimately, The rising cost of debt interest is not just a technical financial issue. It is a structural challenge that affects the government's ability to prioritize investments that strengthen the economy, improve social programs, and provide opportunities for citizens. One of the most critical issues facing the U.S. government today is its heavy reliance on borrowing and the vulnerability that comes with it. The government consistently borrows money to fund operations, pay for deficits, and maintain economic stability. But this dependence on debt creates a significant risk, especially when interest rates fluctuate. When the economy is stable and interest rates are low, borrowing feels manageable, almost routine. However, the situation becomes precarious when rates rise, as even small increases can translate into tens of billions of dollars in additional annual interest payments. This dependence creates a delicate balancing act for policymakers, who must carefully consider not only how much to borrow, but also when and at what cost. The danger lies in the fact that the U.S. government does not operate in isolation. Interest rates are influenced by global financial markets, investor sentiment, and economic policies both domestically and internationally. A shift in any of these factors can have an immediate impact on the cost of borrowing. For instance, if investors demand higher yields to compensate for perceived risk, the government's debt servicing costs can surge rapidly, putting pressure on the federal budget. The ripple effects are significant. Higher interest payments mean less flexibility in funding essential programs like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In turn, this can slow economic growth, reduce public services, and even affect the government's ability to respond to crises such as recessions or natural disasters. The government's dependence on borrowing also limits its policy options. Fiscal strategies that might otherwise stimulate growth, such as increased spending on infrastructure projects or social programs, become harder to implement when a large portion of the budget is already committed to paying interest. This creates a cycle in which borrowing becomes necessary to cover costs, yet the cost of borrowing itself grows, increasing financial strain over time. Additionally, reliance on debt exposes the government to market volatility. Economic shocks, geopolitical tensions, or shifts in investor confidence can rapidly alter borrowing costs, leaving policymakers scrambling to adjust. This uncertainty makes long-term financial planning extremely challenging. Unlike personal finance, where individuals can adjust spending or pay down debt over time, the scale of national debt and interest obligations means that even minor changes in rates or market conditions have amplified consequences. Essentially, the U.S. government's dependence on borrowing functions like a double-edged sword. It provides necessary funds in the short term, but increases vulnerability in the long term. The more reliant the government becomes on external financing, the more susceptible it is to fluctuations in the interest environment, and the more constrained it becomes in making decisions that directly affect economic growth and public welfare. Without careful management, this reliance could continue to grow, leaving less room for innovation, development, and essential services. One of the most overlooked but extremely important aspects of the national debt is the compounding effect of interest over time. When the government borrows money, it agrees to pay interest on that debt. And that interest is not static. It accumulates. Even small increases in interest rates or additional borrowing can lead to significantly higher payments in the future. This is similar to the way a personal loan or credit card balance grows. If only the minimum payment is made, the longer the debt exists, the more interest builds upon itself, creating a snowball effect. For the U.S. government investment, this compounding effect has enormous consequences. Each year, as interest payments increase, they consume a larger portion of the federal budget, leaving fewer resources for essential programs that drive economic growth, social stability, investment, and public welfare. Infrastructure, healthcare, education, and research projects all face the risk of stagnation or reduction because more money is being directed towards servicing past borrowing rather than funding new initiatives. The compounding nature of debt interest also makes it difficult to slow or reverse the trend. Even if borrowing slows, existing debt continues to generate interest that must be paid, meaning that the total financial burden continues to grow. Investment. Over decades, this effect can accelerate the debt cycle, making the country increasingly reliant on borrowing to cover both principal and interest obligations. This cycle is particularly concerning because it can reach a point where the government has limited options to manage its finances. Raising taxes or cutting spending becomes politically and economically challenging, especially when interest payments alone consume a substantial portion of the budget. Compounding interest effectively reduces fiscal flexibility, making it harder for the government to respond to emergencies, invest in new programs, or stimulate the economy during downturns. Another dimension of this issue is that even minor fluctuations in interest rates can have amplified effects due to compounding. A 1 percentage point increase in borrowing costs might seem small on the surface, but when applied to hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, the additional interest can be staggering. Over time, these seemingly minor changes accumulate, adding to the financial strain and making it increasingly difficult to maintain sustainable fiscal policies. Furthermore, compounding interest creates intergenerational challenges. Future taxpayers inherit not only the original debt, but also the accumulated interest, meaning that decisions made today can have long-lasting effects on the country's economic health and policy options. Addressing this issue is not simply a matter of reducing borrowing. It requires strategic management of interest rates, careful consideration of fiscal priorities, investment, and long-term planning to ensure that the cost of debt does not spiral out of control. Without addressing the compounding effect of debt interest, the U.S. government risks being trapped in a cycle where servicing debt dominates the budget, leaving fewer resources available for growth, innovation, and essential public services. If the growth of interest payments on the national debt continues unchecked, the U.S. government could face serious limitations in its ability to manage fiscal policy effectively. Rising interest costs not only consume a larger portion of the federal budget, but also reduce the government's flexibility to respond to economic challenges. One of the most immediate consequences of unchecked debt interest is the potential for credit rating downgrades. Credit agencies evaluate a country's ability to meet its debt obligations, and when interest payments become a significant burden, it signals increased risk to investors. A downgrade can have cascading effects, as it generally leads to higher borrowing costs, meaning that each new dollar the government borrows will carry a higher interest rate. This creates a vicious cycle. Higher interest costs make it harder to fund programs, forcing more borrowing, which in turn increases the interest burden further. Beyond credit ratings, the growth of debt interest can significantly constrain policy options. For instance, during times of economic slowdown or recession, governments typically implement stimulus measures to support growth, such as infrastructure spending, tax relief, or direct financial aid to citizens. However, when a large portion of the budget is already committed to interest payments, the government has fewer resources to deploy in these critical areas. This can slow recovery, prolong unemployment, and reduce overall economic growth, affecting everyday Americans. Another important consideration is the impact on financial markets. The US dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, and treasury bonds are considered among the safest investments globally. However, if interest payments continue to escalate and fiscal sustainability comes into question, investor confidence could waver. This could lead to higher yields on treasury securities as investors demand more compensation for perceived risk, and which would directly increase borrowing costs further. These dynamics don't only affect the government, they ripple through the entire economy. Higher borrowing costs can influence mortgage rates, business loans, and consumer credit, ultimately affecting spending, investment, and economic growth. The compounding nature of these effects makes timely intervention critical. Policymakers must address rising interest payments proactively by balancing borrowing, investment, controlling budget deficits, and exploring strategies to reduce debt growth. Failing to act can lead to a situation where the government has fewer tools to navigate economic challenges, limiting its ability to respond to emergencies or invest in long-term priorities. In essence, investment. Unchecked debt interest not only threatens fiscal stability, but also undermines the government's capacity to govern effectively and maintain public trust. The choices made today regarding borrowing, spending, and interest management will determine whether the country faces a future of financial strain or whether it can maintain flexibility, economic growth, and stability for years to come.